This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist Carroll Dunham. Dunham takes time to discuss the latest iteration of his iconic figurative work up through June 17th at Gladstone's 515 West 24th Street location in New York. The show features drawings of colorful, boldly drawn male and female forms intimately connecting within cubic spaces. In the conversation, I tried to get to a better understanding of Dunham's philosophies and motivations. And now, a conversation about doodles and primal reactions with artist Carroll Dunham. Carroll Dunham, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Carroll, I wanted to welcome you on to talk about a new exhibit you have going on at Gladstone of recent drawings. But, Carroll, a lot of times with artists, I like to start with a hypothetical, which is, say you're sitting at a dinner party next to someone who has never met you and has no idea of what you do or what your work looks like. Where do you start to explain to them what your work consists of?
I don't think I really try to do that. I'm very embarrassed trying to describe my own work. I mean, I'm fine in front of it or in front of pictures of it. That's fine. But with nothing to refer to, I just feel like a gas bag when I start trying to say anything about how to describe it. So now it's easy because you just say, well, if you're really curious, you can look at my website and look at a picture of everything I've ever made. But something about modern art, abstract, blah, 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 just a kind of generic answer to end the conversation.
I think you did open a small window there that I think is rather telling, and that is, over the last 15, 20 years, I think people think of your work as being figurative, but there at the end, before the blah, 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 you referred to the abstraction, right? I guess one of my questions for you is, do you still think of yourself as an abstract painter, and these figures are just vehicles for solving questions of different elements of art and how to use line in abstract ways?
I've come to a point now where I don't see those things as actually exclusive of each other. I think they're both going on. I mean, I think paintings, or in my case, drawings and prints, all of it, hopefully communicates on a number of different levels, depending on how you decide to unpack it. And I'm not satisfied with, I don't think of my paintings as representational art. They didn't evolve from that. They don't start with that premise, even though there are nameable, recognizable subjects in it now. A lot of what drives me forward or kind of keeps me moving in my own work is stuff that I don't think is strictly about the subject matter, because that can, in my case, be quite repetitive. So other things are going on having to do with how things are made and what they're made of and things like that.
Do you feel like your work has an underlying meaning, or do you spend the majority of your time, thinking about the execution and the form?
Well, hopefully it has some, I mean, underlying meaning is an interesting phrase, like, I'm not sure I would be the person who would know that about myself or about my own, the things I make. But I guess you have to work with the assumption that it all adds up to something. I know that's not quite what you mean, but again, it's going on. My relationship to what I'm doing is happening in a number of levels at the same time too. And I spend quite a bit of time thinking about the so-called meaning of what I'm drawing and painting now, because there is a lot of subject matter, and I know that, and it's stuff that's come to me internally, and I try to understand through making things why I would even think to do these things.
Mhm.
I don't have a sense of some meaning in the way that I would be illustrating it. It's nothing like that.
Right.
It's like I would learn the meaning of my own activities by seeing what I've made and then trying to think critically and sympathetically about it and try to understand my own agenda through what I've made, you know.
Sure. I mean, there's the whole allegory of the cave that, maybe we really can't step outside of ourselves and really know who we are. Maybe hearing somebody else talk about our work and elucidate that for us in a way that we can't on our own, right? I guess, the bigger question there is, what do you think draws you to the subject matter? I mean, is it just what maintains your interest, or do you feel like there's something that you can't really put your finger on that's kind of driving you in that direction?
Oh, I think there's a lot of that. Because I know about myself, I can look back over what I've made and I see these almost, it's continuous, but there certainly are chapters or periods of time within which I was clearly just going over and over the same thing from the point of view of subject matter. And it's kind of always been like that. So there must be, as we say, I get hung up on things, or my work does, and then I have to work my way through it. And I guess in a way, this exhibition that you mentioned at the beginning of our talk is a way to try to show that process a little bit, because I use drawing as a way to sort of feel my way ahead in my own work, kind of see what I even think has use, and also it in itself is something that interests me to make, just to make things called drawings. I like doing that. So. But it's more open maybe to a kind of more intimate part of my making my own work than when I would make an exhibition of paintings, which requires a whole different way of thinking about formal presentation, and paintings tend to take a lot longer to work on. There are a lot of different aspects to it. I wanted to do this thing with drawing to kind of open some of this up, what you're asking me about.
Are the drawings, is that like a daily part of your practice? And do the paintings come directly from drawings that you've made, or when you start a painting, are they their own explorations?
It's all those things, really. When I was younger, like when I was kind of figuring out even how to begin my own work, I thought of drawing as almost the main thing I was doing, and that was in the air, in New York in the 70s. There was a big, at least the older artists I was interested in, there was a big emphasis on drawing, and museums and galleries were paying a lot of attention to it. And I had also been a doodler before that, before it got channeled into thinking about art seriously. So all that sort of came together for me. Drawing kind of went in behind my painting for a while, and then I started making prints, which is another way entirely to explore all the same stuff. So I guess at different points, all three of these things have had kind of taken point in terms of where I was with my ideas. Meanwhile, I don't draw every day at all, but when I am in the middle of a lot of times I don't know what to do, and I don't like to just do things when I don't know what to do. But when I'm in the middle of working on something and the whole thing's kind of clear to me, I draw a lot. So I've generated a lot of drawings in my time as an artist, but it's episodic.
No, I think there are some really interesting things buried in what you said there. One about the doodling, I think these drawings certainly communicate kind of a sense of doodling and, line making and, the kind of the way that doodling kind of fills negative space. And also when you're talking about printmaking, the monotypes, how those will typically have these margins. And, this work, it feels like you're playing with the edges and using the doodling to do some really interesting things in those margins. And so it's like, that this work kind of sees the culmination of these things that are kind of at the core of who you are, right?
Possibly. I like that interpretation. I mean, that's a nice set of observations. And they all feel kind of true to me.
You were talking about the 70s. Can you kind of talk about what that was like landing in New York in the 70s and working with Dorothy or Rockburn, and kind of where your head was back then and kind of how everything progressed?
I mean, that working in Dorothea's studio was probably the main influencing factor in how things went from there, because I mean, I was a studio art major at a liberal arts college, and I read a lot of art magazines, but and I had an interest in making things from the point of view of being a, lame carpenter, or, as I said, doodling in my dorm room at night, whatever, but nothing focused. And I hadn't been around art as really practiced as a daily thing in one's life, or as the actual texture of one's life. So that was a big change, much more important than had I gone to graduate school or anything like that, which I didn't do. And it was, but it also was, back then no one had any money, and so what I was doing was really much closer to what we call an internship now. So I had to have, at a certain point, it felt like a long time, but it was probably only a year and a half maximum I worked for her. And then I had to sort of get real about money, and I got a job. And after that, I lay low for a long time. I mean, I had my friends from school, and I had some of the older artists that I'd made friends with for Dorothea. And I would see, I would go to openings in Soho on Saturday and go to bars and bump into people or whatever. But it was years after that I needed to kind of get myself sorted and figure out. I mean, it took me a long time to even understand that painting was something I wanted to pursue. So I didn't start having anyone really come look at my work and then start to have chances to exhibit it until I was almost, I don't know, I was probably 33 or something when I started my work was in group shows a couple of times, things like that. And then after that, it kind of kept going. But that's what the beginning was like. And the art scene was very small. It was, I mean, at least the part that I and a few of my friends were interested in was a few galleries and 20 artists, that we gave a shit about. It was kind of great.
I've read before, the advice of somebody who is giving advice to the stuck artist on, trying to find their own voice. And one of the tips they gave was to imagine your artistic heroes and imagine if they hadn't died, how they would have extended their work. I feel like I've heard you speak before that, somewhere at the genesis of your career, you were actually thinking about what the continued work of Kandinsky would have looked like. Am I remembering that right?
It sounds to me like you might be conflating a couple of things, but
I'm sure I am.
One of the things that I mean, back when I was starting and I really felt like, okay, I see a way into something that like would be my paintings, and I'm going to follow this. And I had read Kandinsky's writing about painting. He not the better known book is called Concerning the Spiritual in Art or something. And that's not the book that I got really excited about. The one I liked a lot was called Point and Line to Plane. And it was a strange little manifesto about, really sort of unpacking how points, lines, and planes function to create a language that can communicate thought and feeling. It's really unlike anything you would ever read today. And I was very interested in Kandinsky's late work, which no one else, no one I knew was thinking about. I mean, you would see a lot of like, who was the first European abstractionist, and he would be one of this handful of white guys who may or may not have been the first European abstractionist. But his later stuff, where he got much more committed to a position, I think is much more eccentric and interesting and specific. And, there's some artists I think about where I feel like it would be plausible to imagine their work in the 23rd century. And I feel that way a bit about his late work. That's a pretty loopy answer to your question.
No, it's fine, and it's just trying to find entry points to understand more about how your work has evolved and how we still find evidence in this latest work. And and I think what's really exciting about this most recent set of drawings is just you seem to be playing more with creating space. Maybe you could speak more about the use of these kind of cubic spaces that you're choosing to put the figures in now, whether we call them cells or what have you. What became the motivation for taking these figures that were kind of living in kind of a flat plane and putting them in something that has the illusion of three dimensions?
I've been spending a lot of time asking myself these exact questions. And it really was, as I think in the beginning, as much as anything, the doodle impulse. I had been working the exhibition is divided into two basic groups of things. One built completely on the color green and the other on the color purple, and more or less. And when I was working on this long project of all this thing involving green figures, green beings inhabiting these pictures, I got involved. The ruling off of the margin, the framing of the scene, the emphasis on this reality ends when the image ends, that kind of idea, which probably did come a lot visually from all my work in printmaking. It's kind of a ubiquitous situation in printmaking to see margins. That would be certainly part of it, but that's not all of it. And I worked like that. For several years, I was involved with this idea of margins, and it migrated into my paintings. And at a certain point, I don't know, I think it's inevitable. You're working a lot and doing basically the same thing over and over. There's some sort of mutation or glitch. And I thought what would happen to draw lines over things, and this space, which I guess I thought it was kind of like rotating the thing into optical space from literal flat space on a surface. And I like that idea very much. And I do think optical space is one of the intrinsic materials of painting. As soon as you make a mark on a surface, the potential for that is there. So, and it's something that makes real the fact that we're creating what we see, because there is no optical space. It makes literal, I should say.
Right.
The fact that as we go, we're creating the manifestations of having an experience here. So I find all of that very interesting to think about. And I guess it got me to just keep going deeper into this. And I kept trying to see, well, if I put these characters in spatial situations, what will that feel like? Is that interpretable as another subject, or is that basically shrouding them in abstraction, whatever that would even mean?
Right.
Cloaking them in abstraction, I guess. And I think like those are the kind of things that just kind of run through my mental stuff while I'm working. I don't have ultimate answers, but I am very involved with these spatial. I think of them almost as spatial diagrams. They're extremely. They don't work. I mean, they're not sensible. They're not perspective in any kind of mechanical sense, but they punch all those buttons when you're looking at them. And I do think about, I don't know what word to use either. You mentioned a few, whatever you said, cell, enclosure, I don't know, container, chamber, room, spatial matrix. I have no idea. And probably spatial matrix is closer to the truth because there is no specific reference.
I think one of the other interesting things that I see in these drawings that I don't think I've seen before in leading up to this point are severed limbs. There are arms and legs of the female form that are just kind of cut off. Was that a result of putting them in the spatial matrix? The fact that box was severing, and then you started playing around with the idea of what that would look like,
it kind of that's pretty clear. I started thinking. I mean, honestly, I see those. The closest I could get to putting language on those kinds of images is, they have to do with almost a hall of mirrors idea of our self-reinforcing projections of making ourselves in the same way we're making the world as we go, we're also making ourselves in the world as we go. And they may be some attempt to diagram / represent / imagine that condition. So part of this idea that there are these kind of self-referential environments is that when something passed outside them, it would cease to exist, and it wouldn't be part of that. And so I guess partly it's a way of, I don't like to think of my work as illustrative in any way, but it came up, this idea of like, well, what if it just ended? If things just ended? And I liked drawing it. I liked I didn't think of it as amputation. I guess it's funny because you really are about the 25th person that I've either walked into or talked to who was like, hey man, what's up with the amputated limbs? And I just isn't how I had been thinking about what I'd been doing until people actually gave me feedback. So I feel a little blind to my own activities. But the way it came up was when I was working on all those green things and the margins, and I was thinking about the subject part of the image ending at these margins and dissolving into this other kind of drawing, which involved spirals and loops and different things that I've really been in my work in one way or the other for a long time, performing different functions and having them perform no quote unquote representational function whatsoever, just kind of being there around.
Sure.
And the intersection of these figure parts that I was drawing with the spirals, uh, at a certain point, I thought it was such a beautiful relationship to have this thing that was kind of nameable, like the arm, just intersecting with this other thing and becoming part of that. So it looked like the arm would just end at the. It's very difficult to do this in a totally verbal medium. I mean, and we don't really have any illustrations here to show. So I'm trying with language. I feel bad for your audience
Oh
because
no, no. Well, I mean, you know what? At the end of the day, Tip, it encourages them to go down to Gladstone and look at these things in person, or to go to carrolldunham.com or wherever. And
we're
so,
the opposite,
right.
whatever they decide.
And so, last year I had photographer Mona Kuhn on the podcast, and she exclusively photographs the nude. And one of the attractions for her is that when you present the human body in that form, it creates imagery that is rather timeless, right? You strip away fad and fashion, and you're left with this timelessness. And your figures in these pieces also seem timeless. I mean, we could be looking back at cavemen, or we could be looking into a dystopian Planet of the Apes sort of future, right?
That's exactly how I see it too.
Are these hyper masculine and hyper feminine sort of representations, or is it tied to kind of this timelessness?
Well, I think all of those things are interrelated and they're all things I think about. I mean, I don't want to make claims about it because I just know what I think about. But um, it's very hard for me now to even remember what possessed me to start trying to take the idea of a figure, a kind of more straight up approach to so-called figurative painting. I can barely remember how that happened. I almost feel like it was another one of these mutation accidents. But by the time I got to the idea of making images with males in them, which was kind of around this subject of wrestling as the organizing idea, uh, I I had already made a whole series of paintings with females as the central idea, the bathers things,
Right.
and and I knew that my what interested me about trying to make images of an entire human body in some way that interacted with the tradition and also felt really just fresh and true to me, that it had to involve this archaic, what you're calling timelessness. I like that word. But to me at the time, I was thinking that there's got to be some sort of archaic vibe to these to these images.
Right.
Like I'm not doing some like it has nothing really to do with contemporary culture, except I can't escape being part of contemporary culture. I operate within that medium as we all do and as we're all fated to. But I wanted it was mostly through the idea of connecting to art history, I think, in the beginning. And then I started to really like it on an almost Jungian basis, I guess, like at least to fantasize about that level of things where it's just sort of the most basic human setup,
Sure.
uh, and try to make an image of that or let the image come together out of the spare parts that seem to rattle around in my work.
Right.
And that's kind of, and then with the males, by that point, I was committed to this idea of we're either, 1 million BC or after World War VI. And I that seemed to really lend an interesting extra little vibrational thing to the subject of the wrestlers, because it is this sort of ritualized violence that wrestling, the premise of wrestling is that.
So I know that over the last 15 years, you've had to deal with people questioning the angles you choose to depict your female forms. And some people have, kind of harassed you with the terms pornographic. And it reminded me of a conversation I had with my painting professor in college, who believed that the nude that makes direct eye contact with the viewer is much closer to crossing that line than the nude that doesn't make eye contact. And I think we see evidence of that from art history, with like the fervor of like Olympia and Le Déjeuner sur l'Herbe. Part of the fervor there was that those figures were, engaging us, the viewer. And I look at the work that you've been making of the bathers, and all these female figures, you've really never shown us their faces. And it's bound to be a conscious decision, right?
It became a conscious decision pretty early on. I mean, I tried doing things with faces, but the first sort of notes I made to myself about the idea of even getting into this, about even taking this angle with, because I'd been sort of working with nominally with a similar subjects prior, but I'd been drawing them very differently. And when I got thinking about it, I knew very early on that if I made faces, they would have personalities. And if they had personalities, they couldn't be archetypes anymore. At least that's how it felt to me. I mean, you can see examples of, to me, a certain phase of Matisse's paintings is a great example of this, where in those paintings of like the figures bowling on the green lawn and things like that from around First World War, just before. But they do have faces, but they somehow manage to be completely, like they may as well be just carvings or something. They don't rise to the level of specific human beings. And I think I was aspiring to something like that. And I couldn't figure out a way to make faces interesting to myself. It felt like a trap.
Is there a fine line between the term archetype and the term objectification? I mean, does that question even make sense?
I'm not sure. Not yet, but I want it to.
So, no, right. So, archetype in terms of like, here is, honoring the female form versus objectifying the female form. I mean, is there?
Well, I never thought about it before because, I guess when I use the word archetype, I think about more. I'm thinking about it as part of like if there's an idea of like a general structure of the Western human mind, which is all I think, we probably know enough to really say much about. It's possible, there's something very appealing about some of Jung's ideas. The idea that the notion that there is a language buried in there somehow of symbols, and that there are these almost, I guess, typologies of, deep memory and experience that affect each of us individually. So when I use the word archetype around, say, an image of a naked human female with white skin, it's partly something that's just been burned into me as a straight male in the culture. It's partly some idealization of my mother from when I was a baby, I'm sure. It's partly my attempt to kind of reimagine a lot of things I had just loved from in the art historical dimension, all these different things at the same time.
A scientist would tell you that there are, visual stimuli related to, why is an areola and a nipple the color it is and the shape it is, and it's basically to provide those untrained eyes of the child to like find this target of that provides them life, right? And the same visual stimuli goes on with other parts of the body that are associated with reproduction, right? So they're those most stimulating parts of your work, are tied to things that are very primal and programmed, within our psyche on a very basic level, right?
Well, I really appreciate your framing it that way because I mean there's it's so clear to me because of my own experience coming to it that I mean if that there's no representation happening in my work. It's a construction. It's a whole different it operates in a whole different relationship to so-called reality. And so the visual language is almost like a bunch of icons or something. Like, why I would feel obliged to draw a squiggly line to represent a spinal cord, but not other things like, I don't know what, the knobs on your ankle or kneecaps or, although I have in fact sometimes drawn kneecaps, but I'm just saying, like, there's some things that feel like they need to be acknowledged in order for the image to reach a threshold of anyone feeling anything about it. And the fact that you mentioned nipples is really interesting because that is, I mean, it's on an idiotic level, it's probably a big signifier out of pornos, but on a kind of more sublime and interesting level, it's one of the first things. It's perhaps an infant's most central object in the entire universe, if for a certain period of time that probably feels like forever. So there's all these different levels to even what we mean when we're thinking about bodies, how we have experienced them, and at what point in our life we're actually where are we slicing in to decide what this is. There's so many different ways to think about naked bodies.
Sure.
And the things in my paintings aren't even that. They're not even photographs. They're just, like I say, they're just these constructions. They're piles of lines and shapes.
It would be a whole different discussion if you were portraying these bodies with the accuracy that Courbet used in, Origin of the World, right?
Probably it would be, in a way, I don't know. That would be, there must be artists that maybe a certain aspect of John Curran's work where you could look at it in that way, but in contemporary. But I don't know, not even really. I have no way of knowing how that thought experiment would turn out.
So are you currently working on paintings? I know we have these drawings up at Gladstone, but do you currently have big panels in the studio?
I have a lot of big blank white canvases in my studio. I'm actually in the middle of a big reorganization of art storage, which is something that's the culmination of many years of making stuff. And now we're moving this because my wife is also an artist. We have this rather intense art storage situation I want to actually start to work on paintings, but I want my painting studio to be a little bigger. So I'm getting moving art storage off the premises of my studio and expanding the room I paint in a little bit. And then I'm going to start working on paintings.
Are they going to look like something similar to the drawings, or is it, will there be these, these cubes and...
It's based on the experience of being me. I guess they will probably start there, and I just don't know. I don't know. I'm trying to keep a really open mind and not pre-visualize what I do next too much. It's a little bit of usually I'm very sort of, by the time I've finished some period of my work, I can often have a sense already of what's waiting for me, but I don't exactly have that right now. So it's a good time for me to reorganize my storage racks and keep putting it off.
Well, listen, I really appreciate you taking time out of your morning to talk to me about this and, opening up, pulling back the curtain on your thought process and what's gone into this collection of drawings. And the show is up at Gladstone, May 9th to June 17th, 515 West 24th Street. Tip, I appreciate your time this morning.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
It was a nice conversation.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.